Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know it's bad when your own mother tells you not to make your engagement all about you, as if the ring on your finger and the man on one knee were nothing more than a minor subplot in someone else's sob story. That was the exact sentence Janice, my mother, offered me over lukewarm coffee and a kitchen that still smelled like wet dog. "Let's not make this a whole thing, Claire," she had said, flipping her spoon in the cup like she was stirring gossip, not sugar. "Your sister just got divorced. The timing, it's just unfortunate." I stared at her, blinking like maybe I hadn't heard her right. But I had, word for word. Janice had a talent for emotional sleight of hand. She could turn any joy into an inconvenience, with just the right intonation. And now, my engagement to Alex, a man who had loved me patiently and fiercely for 8 years, was somehow less relevant than Lindsay's latest heartbreak. To be fair, Lindsay's divorce had come as a shock. She and Mason were the golden couple, at least according to Janice, who frequently reminded anyone who would listen that Lindsay married up. I used to wonder if my mother even remembered Mason's job title because she repeated corporate lawyer like it was a charm against bad taste. But Mason had apparently fallen out of love or into someone else's bed, depending on which version you believed, and now Lindsay was back in her old bedroom, crying into wine glasses and complaining about the neighborhood kids being too loud. Alex proposed on a Friday night in March. He'd cooked dinner himself, scallops, risotto, and asparagus, and I'd laughed when he nearly dropped the ring in the sink because he was too nervous to remember where he'd hidden it. There was no Instagram-worthy setting, no camera tucked in the corner. Just us, 2 candles, a Neil Young record, and a man who looked at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. I called my mom the next morning. I was still giddy, my voice bouncing, my hand shaking just a little from excitement as I told her the news. And she said, "Claire, honey, are you sure you want to say anything yet? Lindsay's really going through it right now." I didn't answer at first. I just held the phone like it had personally betrayed me. She didn't even say congratulations. Not even once. Not a "that's wonderful news" or "I'm so happy for you." Nothing. Just a gentle reprimand wrapped in faux empathy, as if my happiness was unseemly, as if it needed to be shelved until further notice. The following week was a circus of avoidance. My aunt called to say how sorry she was to hear about Lindsay. My cousin messaged me to say she'd be in town soon. Was everything okay at home? Not one person mentioned the engagement. It was like my news had been swallowed by Lindsay's grief, and I'd foolishly thought I could compete for air in the same house. Alex noticed. Of course he did. He was too kind to say much, but I saw it in the way he tightened his jaw every time Janice rerouted a conversation back to Lindsay's emotional wellness or Mason's apparent midlife crisis. "She just needs support right now," Janice said, multiple times. "We need to rally around her." As if I was some sort of luxury item the family couldn't currently afford to acknowledge. When I asked Janice if she was still planning to host the engagement party like we'd discussed months ago, she hesitated. "Well," she said, and I could already feel the twist coming. "I was thinking we could make it more of a dual celebration. For both you and Lindsay. A fresh start for both of you." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. "Dual celebration?" I asked. "She's getting a divorce, Mom." "I'm getting married." "That's not the same damn thing." Janice rolled her eyes, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Don't be petty, Claire. Lindsay's fragile. You know she's always been more sensitive than you. She needs this." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I'd learned it was easier to nod than to argue with Janice when she got that martyr tone in her voice. But inside, something was shifting. A slow, hard click of recognition that this wasn't a one-time oversight. This was a pattern, a hierarchy, and I had never been at the top. So I let her plan the party. I didn't say a word when the invitations went out with a generic "Celebrating New Beginnings" headline. I even smiled when Lindsay showed up to the planning brunch in a white dress and Janice said nothing. But the real kick to the stomach came the week before the party, when I overheard Janice talking to my cousin in the living room. "I'll be giving the toast, of course," she said, her voice smug and sugary. "Just something short about resilience, about how Lindsay's been so brave. You know, things everyone needs to hear." I stood in the hallway, out of view, fingers curling into my sleeves. No mention of me. No mention of Alex. Just another speech about Lindsay's fragile, golden resilience. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was a footnote. That night, I opened my laptop, clicked a private folder, and started typing. If my mom wanted a speech that would be unforgettable, she'd get one. But it wasn't going to come from her lips. Not this time. The first thing I saw when we walked into the room wasn't the smiling faces of my friends or the warm, familiar glint of fairy lights we'd picked out together 2 months ago. It was a banner. A giant, custom-printed, vinyl monstrosity hanging across the center of the ballroom, with soft gold cursive letters screaming the words, "A new chapter for both our girls." I stopped walking the second I read it, my heels clicking once on the hardwood floor and then falling still, like even they were unsure about stepping further into a party that no longer felt like mine. Alex, ever the optimist, leaned toward me and whispered, "Maybe it's a typo?" But I could already see the small, smug smile tugging at Janice's lips across the room, the way she was holding her wine like she'd just pulled off something clever. My stomach turned in slow, nauseating circles as I scanned the crowd, people clapping each other on the back, hugging, sipping champagne. And then I saw her. Lindsay, wearing white. Not ivory or blush or a pale pastel that could be defended as coincidence, but full, bridal white. Floral length. Satin. Sleeveless. She looked radiant. Sure. Happy even. But the moment she saw me, there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. Brief. Like a twitch. Like she knew, deep down, this wasn't right. But before I could say a word, Janice swept across the floor toward us with arms wide and a practiced smile. "You made it," she said, as if this was some casual cookout and not the engagement party I'd been waiting for my entire adult life. "I told you we were coming at 7, I said flatly, not returning her hug. "Is this what I think it is?" I gestured to the banner, to Lindsay, to the whole manufactured performance. Janice tilted her head, performing the role of innocent mother with an Oscar-worthy expression. "Claire, don't be difficult. Lindsay needed this, sweetie. You're getting married. You've got everything ahead of you. She just lost everything. Can't you let her have tonight too?" It was always that way with my mother. If something hurt me, it was probably because I was being too sensitive, too selfish, too cold. But when Lindsay felt pain, it was sacred. A holy thing to be cradled and mourned with casseroles and collective sympathy. I nodded slowly, letting the anger slide down into the pit of my stomach, like something I'd come to expect. I glanced at Alex, whose jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles in his neck twitching. "Fine," I said. One word. That was all I allowed myself. I smiled for the cameras. I greeted people who barely looked at me, their eyes flickering toward Lindsay, with expressions that said they weren't sure which daughter to celebrate. When one of Alex's cousins congratulated Lindsay on the big step, she didn't correct him. She just smiled and said, "Thank you." And Janice beamed beside her like it was her wedding day too. I found myself drifting toward the food table more than once, not because I was hungry, but because it gave me something to do besides scream into a decorative floral arrangement. I watched as people toasted with glasses that had my name on the monogram, but not in their conversation. I caught whispers, confused laughter, speculative glances. I felt like I was watching my own celebration through someone else's eyes, someone who didn't belong. Then came the sound. That telltale clink of silver on glass. I turned around and saw Janice standing at the head of the room, holding up her flute like she'd just been knighted. "If I could have everyone's attention," she began, voice confident, clear, and poised. I don't know why, after everything, some small part of me still hoped, still prayed, that she'd say something about me, about Alex, about the actual reason this event was supposed to exist. But she didn't. Instead, for 5 excruciating minutes, she delivered a speech so saccharine and sanctimonious that it felt like a parody. "Lindsay has shown us all what it means to be resilient," she said, her voice quivering with performative emotion. "She's a fighter, a survivor. She's stepping into a new chapter with grace, courage, and class. We should all be so proud." People clapped. Lindsay blushed. I stood there, numb. Alex looked at me with eyes full of fury and helplessness. My best friend Melissa mouthed, "Are you okay?" And I nodded even though my fingers were shaking around my wine glass. I kept nodding until my throat hurt because it was the only thing I could do without crying. Then I put my glass down. I didn't say anything to Alex. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just walked, calm, collected, silent, toward the hallway behind the catering station. My heels echoed like gunshots in the corridor. When I reached the corner, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in over a year. My hands were still trembling, but my voice came out steady. "Hey," I said, and there was a pause on the other end, a voice I hadn't heard since my last family holiday. "I need a favor," I continued. "And I need it fast." The voice responded. I gave a time, a name, a place. Then I hung up and stared at the blank wall across from me, breathing slowly as the rage finally began to solidify into something cold, deliberate, and sharp. Because if Janice wanted this night to be unforgettable, I would make damn sure she got exactly that. When I walked back into that room, the atmosphere had shifted ever so slightly, as if the oxygen had thinned just enough to make breathing feel intentional. People were still holding their drinks, still laughing in little pockets near the buffet table or lingering near the DJ, but the warmth had dulled. My absence had been noticed, but not spoken about yet. Not until I tapped the side of my glass with the back of a butter knife, sharp and rhythmic, like a countdown. The sound cut through the music and the murmurs like a razor through silk. All heads turned, eyes settling on me, the girl in navy blue with a stone-still expression and a voice just loud enough to hush a room built for noise. I smiled then, not a big, radiant smile, but one with the corners tight and the center hollow, and said, "Actually, I have my own announcement." The words fell like a lit match into dry grass. A few chuckles popped up, nervous and confused. Janice, who had just finished basking in the applause of her Lindsay-centric toast, visibly stiffened. Her grip on her wine glass tightened as she opened her mouth, likely to redirect, to reassert control, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned my face to hers, slowly, deliberately, and with one look, I told her everything I needed her to hear without saying a single word. Her mouth snapped shut, and the silence that followed was almost reverent. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," I began, my tone soft and sentimental enough to lower everyone's defenses. "I figured we could all just enjoy the evening, celebrate love and resilience, and whatever other buzzwords we're tossing around these days." A few polite chuckles followed that line, but I didn't smile. I just let the air thicken. "But then I realized something," I continued, my eyes scanning the crowd. "We've gotten really good in this family at pretending things are okay, haven't we? We tell stories the way we want to hear them. We decorate pain with prettier language, and we decide which parts of the truth are convenient enough to celebrate." I saw heads tilt, confused but engaged. Janice stood motionless, a polite smile frozen on her lips, one eye twitching slightly in what I knew was barely concealed panic. Alex was watching me from the corner of the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I kept going. "It's funny how people treat love like it's disposable," I said, letting the words linger long enough for the second part to sting, unless it's their favorite child losing it. A gasp somewhere in the back, followed by a chair leg scraping against the floor. "Some of you probably don't know this," I said, keeping my voice steady, but when Lindsay was drowning in legal fees during her divorce, Mom told her she just couldn't help financially. Said it wasn't a good time, or that she needed to be independent. I don't remember the exact excuse. What I do remember is writing the first check myself, then the second, and the third. Lindsay's face had gone pale. She looked like she'd been slapped, and I couldn't tell if it was the shock of exposure or the guilt that stung worse. Janice looked like she might combust. Still, I didn't stop. I didn't say anything then because I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, someone would notice the kind of daughter I was without me needing to shout it from the rooftops. I paused here and turned to face Janice directly. But you know what? I said. Silence doesn't earn you love in this family. It just makes you invisible. Someone coughed. Another person whispered. Then came the mistake. I let it tumble out like it wasn't scripted, like it wasn't placed there on purpose. This all started back in 2015. No, wait, I mean 2014, or maybe 2017. Whatever, it was 8 years ago or 6. Math's never been my strong suit. A ripple of awkward laughter moved across the crowd, the kind people release when they don't know what else to do with their discomfort. But I knew exactly what I'd done. I knew there'd be viewers online typing angrily in the comments later. Actually, 2015 wasn't 8 years ago, it was 10. Perfect. I took a breath, a long one, and softened my tone. I'm not telling you this because I want applause. I'm telling you this because I'm done letting other people narrate my story. I'm not the sturdy one who doesn't need praise. I'm not the afterthought. I'm not the background of anyone's redemption arc. By now, Lindsay had tears sliding down her face, silently and ungracefully, and Janice had shifted her weight to one foot, trying desperately to stay composed, her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Nobody clapped. Nobody said a word. And that's when I saw Alex move. He stepped out from his spot in the corner and walked slowly toward the center of the room, one hand slipping into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a plain white envelope, held it up for a moment, then turned to face Janice. This, he said, his voice louder than mine had been, is yours. Janice blinked, confused. Alex walked over, placed the envelope gently into her hands, and stepped back. What is it? Someone whispered. But Janice didn't answer. She just looked down at the envelope, her fingers trembling, as if the paper burned where it touched her skin. And I knew, from the way her face drained of all color, that whatever happened next was going to change everything. Janice stood there holding the envelope like it was a dead bird someone had just handed her at a brunch table, stiff fingers gripping the edge of it while her face did that tight, polished expression she wore whenever she was dangerously close to losing control in front of people she considered her social equals. The room, which had been so animated just minutes earlier, now buzzed with a kind of electrified silence, dozens of people collectively pretending not to lean in, even though their bodies betrayed them with every micro-adjustment toward the drama. Alex didn't say another word. He simply stepped back beside me, hands behind his back like a man who had done his part and now only needed to witness what came next. Janice looked at me, then at the envelope again, as if hoping it would spontaneously combust or dissolve like paper in acid. But when it didn't, when the weight of it remained stubborn and undeniable in her palm, she peeled it open and pulled out the letter with trembling fingers. For a moment, I thought maybe she wouldn't read it. Maybe she'd pocket it or tear it in half or pretend she had no idea what it was. But then she unfolded it, squinted at the familiar handwriting, and began to speak in that same soft voice she always used when pretending to be composed while under fire. At first, only those closest to her could hear. Then, in what could only be described as divine comedy or karmic choreography, the microphone she'd used during her toast, left on, forgotten, and still wired into the overhead speakers, amplified her voice to every corner of the ballroom. Her words rang out with surgical clarity. I just think Claire will be fine. She's always been the sturdy one. Lindsay, though she's fragile, she needs the help more. I have to invest where it'll actually make a difference. There was no scream. No crashing of glasses. Just a stunned, collective inhale, like the room itself had gasped. Janice's face went paper white. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She looked up, wide-eyed, the letter now shaking in her hands, the microphone whining slightly in the background before someone, probably the DJ, mercifully shut it off. But the damage had already been done. There was no undoing the sound of her own voice weaponized against her. No spin tactic that could rewrite those words back into dignity. I stepped forward then, slow and calm, the silence almost too loud in my ears. In case anyone's wondering, I said, pausing to let the echo of her confession settle into every wall, every guest, every drink glass and polished fork on every table. This party isn't for a divorce. I held up my left hand, letting the room see it clearly now. No sparkle, no promise, no engagement ring. This party, I said, my voice sharper now, more deliberate, is for freedom. Mine. There were murmurs, small gasps, a clatter as someone dropped a fork. People were turning to each other, wide-eyed, lips pressed to ears as they tried to whisper faster than the truth was traveling. Janice still hadn't moved. Lindsay stood behind her, tears streaking her makeup, mascara dripping in dark lines that made her look almost theatrical in her grief. And then, from somewhere near the front of the room, Lindsay's voice cracked through the noise. "Wait," she said, too loud, too sudden. "You're not marrying Alex?" I looked at her slowly, like I was seeing her for the first time, not the sister I grew up with, not the porcelain doll Janice wrapped in soft words and special attention, but a woman who genuinely couldn't imagine that this moment wasn't all about her. "No," I said. "I'm not." There was a pause, just a beat too long. Enough time for every eye in the room to shift from Lindsay to Alex and then back to me. This party, I repeated, was never about that. At least not for me. The truth was, I'd taken off the ring 3 weeks ago. Alex and I had really talked, late at night, when the world goes quiet, and you can finally hear your own thoughts for once. We'd admitted what we'd been too scared to face for a while now, that the engagement had been more about the pressure, the expectations, the checkboxes we were supposed to tick before a certain age. We loved each other, yes, but not enough to bind ourselves together with a lifetime of compromise for the sake of optics. So we made a choice, together, quietly, respectfully, to part ways as partners in life, but not in name. But I didn't tell anyone, because I knew if I waited, if I timed it just right, this night could serve a different purpose entirely. Lindsay opened her mouth again, but I didn't let her speak. "Don't make this about you," I said, and the line hit her like a slap. "Not tonight." The crowd didn't cheer. There was no applause. Just the heavy, awkward stillness of a social ecosystem turned inside out. A few guests shuffled toward the exit. One of Janice's friends, an older woman with tightly pinned hair and an expression like someone watching the Titanic sink in real time, grabbed her purse and muttered something about needing air. I turned to Alex. He nodded once. And together we walked out, not fast, not dramatic, but with the slow, steady dignity of two people who had already said everything that needed to be said long before the music started. I didn't look back. Not even once. There's a moment that plays over and over again in my mind, a memory tucked somewhere behind my ribs, sharp and persistent like a splinter you can't dig out, and it's the night Alex proposed, the candles flickering, the risotto cooling on our plates, and the look on his face when I said yes, even though we both knew that wasn't the answer either of us needed. I didn't say yes out of joy or clarity or conviction. I said yes because I was tired. Tired of waiting for my mother to see me. Tired of coming in second. Tired of feeling like my milestones were always someone else's footnotes. I said yes because it felt like the next logical step, not because it felt like the right one. And in that moment, love wasn't the spark in my chest. It was the silence I hoped would finally earn me applause. The weeks that followed were a blur of Pinterest boards and polite smiles, but underneath it all was a growing sense of dislocation. Every time someone congratulated me, I felt a little more like I was playing a part, reciting lines from a script someone else had written. Every time Alex talked about venues or caterers, I felt the distance widen between us, not because we didn't care about each other, but because we were no longer heading in the same direction. And when we finally sat down one night, long after midnight, with the city lights painting the walls of our apartment in gold, we said what we should have said months earlier, that we loved each other, but we were done pretending that love was enough. So we made a plan. Quietly. Respectfully. We would end things on our terms, with kindness, without drama, without the emotional bloodbath our families would expect. And we would use the party not as an engagement celebration, not as a wedding launchpad, but as the final page in a chapter neither of us wanted to keep rereading. It would be the moment I stopped begging to be seen, the moment I chose my voice over their approval. When Lindsay ran out of the ballroom, her heels clattering like gunfire across the tile floor, she didn't look back. She clutched her clutch to her chest like it might save her from drowning in the weight of the silence she could no longer command. And when Janice followed her, calling her name with the kind of maternal desperation I had never once heard directed at me, the crowd watched them disappear with a mix of pity, confusion, and something close to awe. I stood still, surrounded by people who suddenly didn't know where to look. Their gazes flickered between me and the now empty arch where the banner had hung, the words "a new chapter" for both our girls, dangling like a bitter joke over the ruins of a party no one could make sense of anymore. "I'm not marrying into a life where I'm second best," I said, my voice low but firm enough to ripple through the quiet. Not to my mom, not to my own voice. And that was it. I didn't need applause. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted space. Space to be mine. Space to be free. Alex moved beside me again, silent but steady, and for a moment I just breathed in the stillness of it all, the soft hum of the speakers, the clink of a glass being set down too quickly, the hush of a room rearranging itself around a new truth. What no one in that room knew, not even Janice, not even Lindsay, was that 6 months earlier, Alex and I had started something new together. Not a relationship. Not a second chance. A company. A creative agency we'd built from the ground up in quiet hours between his work trips and my freelance gigs, fueled not by romance, but by respect and trust and the understanding that sometimes the best kind of partnership is the one that doesn't ask you to shrink. And when Lindsay had begged to invest, eager to rebrand herself after the divorce, to slap her name on something she hadn't built, I had said no. Kindly. Firmly. And now, watching the aftermath of this disaster unfold, I knew exactly why I had drawn that line. As Alex and I walked toward the doors, the weight of everything we'd said and done trailing behind us like the last breeze of a closing storm, I heard it. A single clap. Then another. Then silence. No standing ovation. No dramatic exit soundtrack. Just a strange, solemn acknowledgement from people who had no idea what they had just witnessed, but somehow understood it mattered. The next morning, my phone rang before I'd even made coffee. Janice's name lit up the screen, flashing like a warning. I didn't answer. She called again and again, each call shorter than the last, each one swallowed into the black hole of my voicemail, like screams into a canyon. Finally, she left a message, her voice cracking beneath the polished veneer. "Claire, please, call me." I didn't know it meant so much to you. I didn't know. But she had. She'd always known. She just didn't care until the narrative stopped being hers to control. I set the phone down, turned the burner on, and poured the water for my tea. Outside, the city stretched out under a sky so brilliantly blank it felt like a tabula rasa, a promise that nothing that came before had to define what came next. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't a slap. It's walking away, with your peace louder than their applause.